Hello, and welcome to Follow Your Curiosity, where we explore the ups and downs of the creative process and how to keep it moving. I'm your host, Nancy Norbeck. I am a writer, singer, improv comedy newbie, science fiction geek, and creativity coach who loves helping right-brained folks get unstuck. I am so excited to be coming to you with interviews and coaching calls to show you the depth and breadth both of creative pursuits and creative people, to give you some insight into their experiences and to inspire you. One of the reasons I started this podcast was to explore creativity and curiosity in all its forms, including those we don't tend to think of as creative, because I'm pretty sure there's very little in this world that doesn't qualify. My guest today is a great example of that very belief. I was thrilled recently to be heading to a Doctor Who convention and have the opportunity to meet up with Robert Smith, a mathematician and fellow fan who not only uses mathematical models to help improve disease management, but who also gained some unexpected fame for modeling zombie outbreaks. The convention was canceled, but Robert was kind enough to talk to me anyway. I know math and zombies may not be what you were expecting, but I promise you won't regret sticking around to hear about just how creative math can be and how that zombie study has had actual real-world impact. And yes, we talk a little about Doctor Who, since Robert has written quite a few books about the good doctor and his adventures. I'm so very pleased to introduce you to Robert Smith. First of all, I'm really, really grateful that you're interested in talking to me. And also, I'm desperately curious because I will confess there's a reason why I majored in English. And it's not that I could never do math. It was just that it never really resonated for me. And it certainly, to me, I still think of math as you have an equation, you get one answer, and that's just how it always is. So I really, really want to hear what you have to say about how math is creative.
Right. Okay. So I guess I think of math as a language. It's a dense language, very dense language for some people. But the great thing is it has inherently it has logic and rigor. And so if you want to solve a problem, you're right in some ways, right? It's like you have a premise and then you lead inexorably to a conclusion. And so that conclusion is absolutely robust. If you didn't make any math mistakes, you have an answer that is effectively true, even though your premise may be false. And so, I may have built the wrong model or something like that, but I have a robust system. So for me, math is a tool. Math is something that I use to study infectious diseases. So I effectively think of it as a translation. So I translate from the real world, which is noisy and messy and unpredictable, and I translate into the language of mathematics because of this access to logic and rigor. And then I can have a kind of way through the darkness so I can find an answer that I probably wouldn't have been able to find, or at least have such confidence in, if I was just in the real world. And then I bring it back to the real world. And then I say, okay, now I've solved my real world problem with a real world answer. I just visited Mathland to do it, right? And come back. And then I might say, okay, is this, maybe I've solved my problem, or maybe this doesn't make any sense, right? Or maybe something is not quite right. And if something is not quite right, then I say, I know exactly where the problem is. It's not in the math solution because that's a robust system. It's not translating it back to the real world because that's very easy from like my answer back to the real world. It's creating my model in the first place. And so I kind of go back to my model and say, okay, I need to think much more creatively about what is in this. And I may have ignored things that I should have, considered. I may have considered things in the wrong way. I might have used one kind of form of the function instead of another form. And so for me, that's where I kind of start to kind of delve deeply into exactly what it is that I'm modeling here. How am I doing it? What are the different pieces? And it's a giant jigsaw puzzle to me. I'm sort of pulling all these things together and saying, okay, let's try it. And I may go around this cycle many times. Like I may say, okay, new model, analyze, conclusion, check with the data, see if this makes sense. No, maybe not. Or, talk to biologists or so on. Let me retranslate again, make another model, analyze, come back to the conclusion. And I do this enough times until I have a very good sense of kind of, what's going on, how much do I understand, and also how much can I predict in the future. And for me, math is a very good tool for predicting because you have this way of basically rolling stuff out that is very inexorable. And so I think for me, it's like I think with my mathematician's hat on, yes, of course, I'm just starting with one thing and trying to get an answer out. But with my kind of sort of scientist hat on, let's say I'm mixing and matching back and forth between two things that I'm trying to match to get the best sort of outcome. I'm not trying to get a true outcome necessarily. My model is probably not going to be a true fact. It's going to be a useful description of what's going on. And I hope to get insights I can build a model that's absolutely accurate, but I probably can't analyze that. And so again, I'm making trade-offs to try and say, okay, I will live with some assumptions or some things that I've ignored. But it's just like making a map. Like if I have a paper map, if that was one-to-one, that would be a useless map. I could not fit it in my pocket, and I don't need a map that's one-to-one because I have the real world for that. So instead, I want a map that scales down and say, okay, I need to know what's the important things. What can I leave out? If I need to get home, I need to say, okay, I need to walk to the corner, turn left, see McDonald's, turn there, like the key information, not every blade of grass. And of course, it depends on the scale of the problem. And so I guess now if you think of, say, Google Maps, right, you may zoom in or zoom out. But again, you're still trying to identify what are the key features and what do we need to put in. So for me, that's where actually it involves a lot of creativity and also a lot of discussion with people and kind of, hashing out the model and trying to figure out exactly what are we putting in and, how are we doing it and so on. And I don't need my sort of biology colleagues to understand necessarily all the technical math stuff. What I need them to understand is make the model in the first place. Because I can go away and analyze it, but I don't always have the same instincts and the same experience that they do. So we can together kind of build these good models that, can kind of help us in the real world.
Can you give me an example of how you take the real world and translate it into math and back again?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. So one of the first major projects I worked on was for considering a HIV vaccine. So there is no vaccine for HIV. So this is a great place where math can come in. And so we said, well, what if there was one, right? And so we looked at all the vaccines in development, and they all have a few things in common. And so one of the things is they're saying the vaccine probably is not going to work very well, right? So that means that the vaccine will sometimes protect you, but more often, in fact, quite often, it will let you get infected. But then the idea is it makes it less bad for you. So the idea is you still, sometimes you don't get HIV when you would have otherwise, but sometimes you do get it, but then it's less bad. So and that means you live longer. Also, you're less likely to pass on to other people. And so we were sort of saying, okay, from this kind of premise, because that seems to be the premise of all the vaccines that they're building, what would that mean? And so we built a model which basically incorporated those things. And so we've now got this idea for a system where we have a vaccination and so on. And then what's the net outcome? Okay, so let's roll this out and see. And the particular question we were concerned with is, could a HIV vaccine make things worse? And the answer turns out to be very clearly yes. Right? And mathematically you show this and say, okay, right, now is our task to figure out, does this make sense or not? Right? So we've just shown that the vaccine is going to make things worse. And because you tell people, they say, well, but surely that seems backwards.
Yeah.
People think a vaccine is good. And then you start to realize, okay, well, what factors are going into this? And one thing you realize is that if people are living longer with the disease, which is a great outcome that you want, well, now they're just alive longer to have more sex partners, to share more needles and so on. And so they can just spread HIV by existing for longer. And so, okay, we do want them to exist for longer. That's good. And then you figure out trade-offs and said, okay, we could allow that. And that is exactly what we want, of course. But the trade-off is you need to lower the viral load. And so there's effectively an individual-based concern, which is the person with HIV wants to live as long as possible. And then there's a group concern, which is you want less HIV in the community. And so if you can lower the amount of virus sufficiently, well, that it helps for long life, but it also helps for reducing the transmission. And these two are not quite so one-to-one. So what you want to do is design vaccines that will lower the transmission, and we can precisely quantify how much for years of life saved. And we can say for every year of life saved, here is how much transmission you need to lower by. And if you're going to release a vaccine that only gave you extra life, but didn't reduce the transmission, that's going to be a bad vaccine. So, of course, you want years of life, but you also want less HIV all over. And so that was sort of part one. And then we went to part two, which said, okay, the obvious problem with the HIV vaccine is a lot of people are going to say, hooray, I never have to use a condom again. I can share all the needles I want. I'm going to be very risky.
Yes.
And if risk behavior goes up, then you have a huge problem, right? Because now you have this vaccine that doesn't work that well. And yet lots of people who either got the vaccine are going to be going crazy, or possibly people who didn't get the vaccine are going to be going crazy because they say, oh, well, people are vaccinated out there, so my risk has probably gone down. Or maybe it's the opposite, right? Maybe the vaccinated people who have access to the medical system, you give them literature and really, push this message of this is not a cure-all and so on. You need to still, wear condoms and, reduce your risky behavior. Maybe they do reduce your risk behavior because they've had the vaccine. And the people who haven't, maybe they reduce because they didn't get the vaccine, or maybe they increase. And the honest truth is you don't know. You have no way of knowing what people are going to be doing. And people are really hard to model. So the great thing about mathematics is you can do all options at once. And so we said, well, what if the vaccinated go up? What if they go down? What if the risk behavior goes up or down in the unvaccinated? And then we showed actually it's the unvaccinated who are driving this. What the unvaccinated do really makes a big difference. If the unvaccinated reduce their risky behavior, well, the obvious thing, if that was really always true, is don't vaccinate anyone, right? If everyone's not vaccinated and they're reducing their behavior, you've just made things better. But that's obviously not very likely. That's kind of the propaganda vaccine. And so, it's like, hey, this is a great vaccine, but you'd better be better if you don't have it. Some people may do that, but that's probably not the case. But assuming you actually have a vaccine, then it still matters a lot. So whether the vaccinated increase or decrease, you just get a sort of slight change in the system. But if the unvaccinated increase or decrease, then you have a massive change in strategy. And so it's really interesting because it says like, okay, the people who are going to be driving this are the very people you don't have contact with. So we need to call in the social scientists now because we need to understand what people are actually going to do with a HIV vaccine, even if they don't actually get it, right? And so you need to sort of understand human behavior and how people are going to react and so on. And so it leads you down this garden path, but to all kinds of interesting stuff that I think, for me anyway, draws together, kind of the biology, the mathematics, the social science. You start to pull all this stuff together and think of it as kind of a global problem. And it just started from a simple, what if there's a vaccine? What then? And all this stuff rolls out. But I think math gives you a really nice idea of seeing what are all the possibilities, because you can look at them all at once.
Yeah, just hearing you describe it, not actually being involved in the process, which I'm sure took a lot of time, sounds a bit overwhelming. But I'm also fascinated by the fact that it seems to get into everything. It's like it's going well beyond the question of all of the biological factors.
Yes, exactly. And I'm very much one for kind of a holistic approach to disease. I teach a disease modeling course where some of it is learning the biology, some of it is making models using mathematics and analyzing them, and some of it is, class discussions about the ethics of, disease control, which are absolutely fascinating, and all this stuff that pops up, and, people writing essays on, ethical issues and giving presentations and so on, because I feel it's very important to treat scientists, like with this kind of sort of, like understanding that these problems are not just limited to science. Like, you're going to have knock-on effects, and you could invent this great, scientific thing. And if it turns out to be a super weapon that's going to wipe out humanity, maybe you should think about that. And maybe you should examine the consequences and so on. And so many scientists are not interested in that at all. And I've had lots of conversations with people and talking about stuff. And they're like, well, we don't care. We just want, grant money. And we just want to win a Nobel Prize for inventing something new. And so I'm like, okay, but you also have to think about the consequences of your actions. And I think that is something that has not really been done that much. And I think a part of the problem is just this polarization of topics. There are people who are math people and they don't write essays. And there are people who are social science type people who don't do math. And these groups have grown further apart over the years. And I think we need to bring them back together, because to solve any actual problems of the world, you need everyone, right? You need everybody's skills kind of working in tandem, not making these artificial divisions.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, so you've brought to mind two things, one of which is that when I was reading one of your articles in the bio that mentioned chaos theory, I, of course, immediately, being who I am, thought of Ian Malcolm. And what you just said also reminded me of, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But I also wondered, because you do have a fairly varied background and interest set, here at least there is such an emphasis now on STEM, and it's like we're divorcing all of the science and engineering and math from the arts. And then sometimes people talk about STEAM, so they include the arts, which then I'm like, well, you've basically got everything then. So, what's the distinction? But, I'm curious to know what your experience is with that, because it sounds to me like you might agree with me that we probably need to keep things together more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the funny things actually is mathematics used to not be a science. Mathematics was an art. It was like philosophy. It was the study of kind of, purity and sort of deep thought and so on. And math used to be in sort of, arts departments. And it kind of, over many, many generations kind of drifted over into science. And now we sort of say, oh, it's useful for physics and things like that. And that's also true. But I think mathematics is one that actually can do all kinds of things. And so, it happens to have landed in science, and so now we sort of have STEM. And I sort of understand why there's a big push on STEM. I think that, science is under incredible assault at the moment.
True.
That, it's very easy to kind of, paint scientists as villains, as many, many movies do. I think a lot of this comes out of sort of, Second World War stuff and sort of, Nazi experimentation and stuff. And the idea that, there are people smarter than you who are, potentially making experiments that you know nothing about and can't understand is a very terrifying idea to most people. And so that pushes people away. And then you kind of, the boot on the throat of this is, of course, it's, very easy for governments and, sort of, special interests and so on to kind of say, oh, those wacky scientists, like, they're all trying to do wacky things and, and we don't believe any of it. And, like you can easily sow the seeds of doubt for climate change or all sorts of things, and of course, science is not one of those, let's just have an answer and it's it, right? It's science is about kind of the discussion and about throwing more and more questions at something. So it's very easy to hijack that and just say like, oh, okay, well, the scientists don't agree anyway, so do whatever the hell you want, because but actually that's not the right approach, right? The right approach is like, yes, people disagree. That doesn't mean there is no, better answer or less good answer or something. And it also doesn't mean that certain things aren't going to happen, just because you don't really know the ultimate single answer. Like it's not a binary, but it doesn't mean it's not useful.
Definitely. I had not realized that math used to be an art.
Yeah, It still is in some places, actually. In some universities will still have math not in the science departments, sort of for historical reasons.
Wow. I mean, I also read your article about all of your tattoos. So obviously having, actually, I should probably let you explain that briefly.
Yes. So I, in the last couple, maybe 3-4 years or so, I've been tattooing myself with kind of, funky designs. And so there's great mathematical images. So I have the Mandelbrot set, which is to me a very visually arresting one. It's from chaos theory. And it's a little bit sort of, in the weeds to describe. It's sort of it's a set of like kind of constants where a very simple iterative map kind of converges. Which doesn't sound that intuitive, but if you Google Mandelbrot set, you see really funky pictures.
Yeah.
And for me, this actually encapsulates something really cool about math, that I think that, you don't need to understand everything about math to kind of get cool stuff out of it. And we certainly do this in other fields, like in physics. Most people, are very interested in things like, black holes or quarks or Higgs bosons and so on. We can all be like, oh, that sounds really exciting, without having any particular idea of how we actually go and find these or understand them. And, we're not going to read the equations and so on. We're just going to go, oh, cool, and so, I don't see why math can't be the same, actually. I think that math can be just as fascinating and just as exciting to, many more people than it is, who don't need to go and look at equations. And they sometimes liken, math teaching to like, learning the guitar where you never pick up a guitar, right? And so you're just learning theory, and you say, well, this is very boring. And of course it would be boring, right? And then eventually somebody hands you a guitar and you go, oh, okay, now I know how to play it because I've learned the theory. But that is not how most people learn the guitar, right? You pick up a guitar, start, niddling around, doing stuff. And I think we should be doing more of this. We should be kind of saying, okay, let's have fun with math and let's figure that out and then inspire questions that way. This is part of what I was trying to do with sort of my zombie stuff, was kind of reach people in a different way, reach them in a place that wasn't the traditional kind of math stuff, and say, okay, let's go find out where people actually are and meet them there. And so I'm a big proponent of that. And I think the tattoos have kind of brought me to a place where, I can do fun explanations of math. I mean, I have a like period doubling root to chaos diagram on my arm. So lots of people see that and they're sort of like, what's that interesting design there? And then you start explaining and they sort of, at first they realize, oh, I've gotten trapped in a math conversation. But you're not using any equations, and you can talk about, your heartbeat is in a double beat, and that it sometimes bifurcates into a 4-beat and an 8-beat and a 16-beat, and that's called a heart attack. And you really don't want that, and so you might change some underlying parameters, like with a defibrillator, move back to a 2-beat, and people can sort of go, yeah, okay, all right, I kind of get what you're talking about. I have a heart too, we make some connection, and he didn't throw any equations at me, so I guess I'm a survivor. Okay. Didn't kill me. I guess we can go on to the next one.
So those of us who aren't mathematicians are math survivors, are we?
Yes, exactly. Well, I think there's a lot of kind of trauma around math, actually, that you talk to people and people either say, oh, I used to love math and I did up to high school or wherever it was they stopped, and that was cool. But there's a large group of people who are very proud of their math ignorance. They're like, oh, I'm terrible at mathematics, and oh, I'm no good at that. And you sort of think, like, if this were reading or something, people don't be like, oh, I can't read. Oh, no, I wouldn't. And it's funny that it's so socially acceptable to be, proudly displaying your ignorance, and but I get it too. I'm also like, yeah, this is a very dense subject. I was teaching a workshop for Public Health Agency of Canada, which is like the CDC of Canada, effectively, and we invited all these, very eminent people, they like do policy decisions and so on about, health stuff all across Canada. And they came and we were giving like a 2-week workshop, and a bunch of people literally fled the room on day one because they saw equations. And their boss was like, you get back in here because this is a serious workshop and we have to do this. And they were running from the room saying, you can fire me if you want. I am not going back in there.
Wow.
And so you think, how do you reach people who are so terrified of equations that they're going to, literally risk their job? And I actually went to a follow-up some months later, and people were talking about this, and they were literally using the word, I'm a survivor, like, because I was at their workshop, and oh my God, there was math. And of course, all the math side, we tried to keep it as simple as we reasonably could. Mm-hmm. And actually, in the end, was quite successful, and we got a lot of good stuff out of it. But it's a really hard one. It's a hard kind of, hump to get over. Because people have this sort of inbuilt trauma from, high school or whatever, which, is usually not taught very well, and engages only a very small segment, and really, really, really frightens the vast majority of people, I think.
Yeah, my dad's best friend was a terrible math student, had a very, very hard time with it. And God bless him, he went out and became a math teacher so that he could help kids who had trouble just like he did. So he probably was one of the good ones, but... Yeah. Most of us.
Yeah, and the good ones are there, but they're not everywhere.
Yeah, most of us didn't have that kind of teacher. So, since you mentioned the zombies,
yes,
do tell.
Okay. Well, so I was teaching my very holistic disease modeling course, and so students had learned all kinds of things about disease, and I gave them a project, and it said, make a mathematical model of any disease you like. And so, illustrate all the math techniques that we've been learning, but, pick your favorite disease. And people did HIV, malaria, whatever, and tropical diseases and all kinds of things. And one group did zombies. And I immediately thought, this is amazing for the class. Like, my vision was very small. My vision was like, oh, this will make a great class presentation. So I just sort of got my educator hat on, thinking, that'll really help the other students. And the students who came to me, they said later, they thought we thought you would never go for it. They thought, there's no way our professor is going to let us do zombies. But because I was a science fiction person, I'm like, bring it on. This is amazing. And I think I really did grasp this idea of the education part of it. And I didn't see how big it was going to get, but I love the idea that you could sort of, take a fun approach. The good thing about zombies is, of course, there'd never been a zombie model before, because why? and then, but new diseases come along all the time, and so the zombies illustrated the process. And the process is you have to go back to the biology. In this case, video games and movies, but you go back to sort of what there is, and you kind of invent the model from that. And a lot of times this is done backwards. A lot of people kind of come up with some model and then kind of shop it around and kind of have a very poor fit to the biology. And I've always maintained you have to do it properly. You have to go back to first principles, figure out what problem you're trying to solve, what application are you doing, write down the equations that come from it naturally. And so there are, of course, things in the zombie model that, don't appear in any other model. So, for example, the dead don't come back to life in any other. Thank goodness. Sometimes the dead are a factor, so they're a factor in Ebola. So dead bodies can still infect you. So actually, we learn some things from zombies that are actually useful in the real world. But another factor is you don't generally kill anyone who's infected. I mean,
right.
You may sort of want to or something, but you don't go and execute people with the flu. You try and help them. But with zombies, you're just trying to take them out, and so it's a very different approach. So there are some massive differences, but on the other hand, there are many similarities. Of course, there's people who are infectious who are going to infect you if you don't protect yourself in some way, and all people will die of natural causes along the way. Babies might be born. There's all kinds of stuff kind of going on, and those things you can import from other models. And so you kind of make these models, and I guess the funny thing that happened was, well, shortly after the zombie stuff, swine flu came along, and we had to do exactly that. And we had to basically say, okay, nobody does anything about swine flu. Let's figure out the biology. Let's make a mathematical model. Let's show. And it was only a few months later, and all the stuff that had been done with zombies was a very good illustration of like, this is how this works. And so, actually, there's been a few cases where stuff that we learned from doing the zombie modeling was actually helpful in other diseases. So one is the Ebola situation. Another one is because we were having, there's the infection term and then there's the killing the infected people term. So these two complicated terms. And people had always said, you can't put in two very complicated terms. It just makes the models too hard. And we were doing a model of HPV, so human papillomavirus, and we're dealing with sort of heterosexual transmission, but also homosexual transmission. And people said, but that's going to involve these two complicated terms. And I was like, wait, I've done this before. I know what I'm doing here. They were like, no, are the zombies going to help us with a real problem? Like, this is amazing. And it gave us mathematical insights as well. So it was kind of fun stuff. And it's very interesting. It went viral, which I was astonished by. And I was sort of like, oh, right, I guess it's riding on the back of zombies, which are a fun kind of, thought experiment, really. but also, everybody has an investment in zombies somehow. Like my mother knows what zombies are. She's never seen a zombie movie. People zombie-proof their houses. And you kind of, at the end of the day, it's a fun game. If you want to zombie-proof your house, go right ahead, right? On the other hand, if there is a pandemic or something, or an earthquake, whatever, if you have a lot of tin food in your basement, maybe that's not such a bad thing, right? And the CDC got on this too, and they came up with this sort of zombie plan as well. I was actually visiting the CDC at the time because they said, well, this is, people might actually listen to this one, even though it's zombies, which you would think people would be less inclined to, but actually they're more inclined to. I think because you can play a thought experiment in a way that, like, thinking about, an Ebola outbreak is kind of a bit too close to home. Let's worry about that if and when it happens. But zombies, we can always be ready for those. And so I think that same education idea of kind of, for me, educating the rest of my class, it just extended outward. And a lot of people were very surprised to know that there was even such a thing as disease modeling. People said, I didn't know you could use mathematics to study diseases. This is amazing. And a lot of people, I found out later, actually went into the field of disease modeling because of zombies. They were like, this is amazing. This is what I want to do with my life.
Oh, that's cool.
This is amazing. Yeah. So it really touched a lot of people, really inspired a lot of people. It was also interesting to watch it spread through the media because I'd actually done some work on looking at the effect of the media on diseases. So I looked at media and influenza. And so I sort of thought, well, I might as well look at media and zombies. And I also tracked my own data because I was like watching my own story fly through the media. And I kept Twitter data and Google News data you can find, all sorts of things. And I actually wrote a model of the spread of the zombie story through the media because it went viral and I do viruses. So I was like, oh, why not? Let's make this very meta.
Well, that's cool. I have to think that the novelty value of zombies probably got a lot of people's attention too. It
did, yes. And I think marrying two very unexpected things like zombies and math, just, nobody thought those would go together at all.
Right.
And actually, what's funny is there's a lot of zombie models out there now. Like I feel like we kind of accidentally invented this some sort of discipline of zombie modeling, and you get them turning up all the time, and they're sometimes very handy and very interesting, and have neat mathematical sort of things going on. So it's every time I think this project is dead, it comes back to life, and then I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah.
So when you're doing something like that with, zombies that, something that doesn't exist, how do you know that you got your model right?
Very good question. I think the same way we know with anything, which is that you kind of, you can sort of parameterize your model based on some things and then you check it against other things. So it might be that you have, data about some disease right now, and then you make a model, and then maybe you leave off some of the data, and you see if the model predicts the data that you didn't include, and so then you get a good sense of if this makes sense. Or you just make your model now, and you see what happens as more data comes in later. But you can do the same thing for the zombies. You can make it based on some movies and some video games, and then test it against other ones. And that's basically what we did. And I kept sending my students off to watch more video games and do things. I mean, the fact that I had a kind of, pop culture kind of sensibility really helped because, they came and told me we've got their model and, here's the thing. And I just said, this thing happens in Shaun of the Dead and, you haven't included it. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're right. And so that's something that, I had because I'm a sci-fi person, a horror fan, zombie person, I wasn't a pre-existing zombie person per se, but I'd watched enough movies. And so it was very natural to kind of absorb. And so I think having that background had, made a big difference actually.
Man, I'm just imagining being the student being told, go watch another movie.
Yeah. It was quite funny because they sort of slunk out of the office like, oh, okay, I guess we got homework to do.
But of all the homework you could have, exactly. It'd be like if you said to me, go watch these 4 episodes of Doctor Who and come back and tell me what you learned. I'd be like, okay.
Yeah, if I must.
I don't think I'd argue with that in the slightest.
Yes.
So how did you end up, if we kind of go back in time, how did you come to discover what you love about math in the first place?
Oh, that's a very good question. So I think actually a large part of it was Doctor Who. So I was a Doctor Who fan since I was, 5 years old. My father had been he was actually a fan of William Hartnell. And so he just watched everything William Hartnell was in, including Doctor Who back in the day. Cool. And then because he had watched Doctor Who, he was kind of watching it again. And I was, watching a John Pertwee episode and just was blown away. Like I was watching The Green Death and, I'm sort of watching, like, wow, there's maggots and soldiers. And I'm kind of like, no. I can't watch this new show. I'm 5 years old. And I'm like, no, I'm overcommitted. I've got too many shows. And then so I went back to my room, and then I came out again. I thought I might just peek around, and then I saw the thing that made all the difference: the giant fly. And I'm like 5 years old, going, I have never seen anything so amazing. So I am hooked. And so for me, I'm now this Doctor Who fan, and kind of, I guess I was smart and I was, kind of a nerd and everything, and it was not cool to be a nerd back then. But actually, Logopolis, Tom Baker's last story, is all about mathematicians sort of modeling the universe and kind of sustaining it. And basically, through mathematics comes ultimate power. And I thought, I'll have some of that. That sounds
It's funny because I had just thought of Logopolis right before you said it.
Yes, exactly.
I think you could model the universe.
I think the character of the Doctor as well, this kind of, flamboyant scientist, I was like, oh, I like this. And he's very smart, but he's also not just smart. And it's funny because there's a lot of critiques of science, right? And so, and the Doctor's often critiquing very short-sighted scientists. You look in Planet of Evil or something, and he basically talks this guy into committing suicide because of scientific ethics. And the guy's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. You're right. I pushed the boundaries of science and I wasn't ready. I'll go kill myself. Fair enough. And it's only because the monster takes him over that this doesn't happen. He's ready. He presses eject. He's ready to go. I'm like, this is very odd for a very science-led show to kind of be like, it's not rah-rah-rah scientists. It's like a particular kind of scientist. And I think I just absorbed that into my DNA. I was just like, yes, right. Science is an amazing thing, also has potential for misuse. And it's not just a science. And I think also, particularly Tom Baker, you sort of see, like when he meets Romana, for instance, and she's way more qualified than he is. But he's also like, yeah, there's also empirical stuff too, and experience and things, and just kind of having instincts for things and so on. And I feel like I drew in a lot of this stuff actually. And so for me, that was very big. And so when I, sort of rose through the, system and then eventually became like a professor, I was like, this is like a duck to water here. And my job is basically to be an international superstar. And I'm like, cool. I've trained for this my whole life.
I watched The Doctor. I have this down.
Yes, exactly. And I travel all the time, and I feel like, yep. I don't have a TARDIS, but I have the next best thing. I'm all over the world. I mean, diseases are everywhere, and I have expertise. I was in Cameroon a week and a half ago. Heading to Namibia next month. I'm going to be in Nepal later in the year. And I was in Malaysia, the Philippines, India, Russia, all in the last couple of months. I'm all over, and I kind of feel like this is not unlike Doctor Who. I didn't quite imagine just how similar it would be in some ways. And you kind of, dash around the world, putting out fires, and, that's kind of cool. And meeting people and, making friends and, trying to make the world a bit better.
Well, I wouldn't have thought of, and I shouldn't even say this, I feel like, because everything that you've been talking about is stuff that I wouldn't have thought of a mathematician doing. But, the idea that you are going all around the world are you gathering data that you end up using, or are you doing something more practical while you're there to help out in a given situation, or how does that work?
I'd say it varies a lot. So, for example, I went to Chile in November because I was at a math conference in Australia, and I was having a 5-minute conversation with somebody who I'd vaguely met once before, and she was just sort of announcing to a group, and she said, I've got 2 problems. She's like, my first problem is I have, I'm not really an applied mathematician. I have all this data from the Chilean government who collect all this data, but they don't do anything with it. So it's all sitting there waiting to be analyzed. So I need somebody who's an expert in understanding data, creating models, applying them to policy and developing recommendations. And specifically, we were looking at rotavirus because there's a vaccine in North America and various places, but there's no vaccine in Chile. And they were like, should we introduce a vaccine? And so basically look at the data, see what happens and so on, make recommendations. And I was sort of thinking this is my name on it. So I was like, oh, you need someone? I could do that. And then she said, my other problem is I have all this grant money to spend, and it has to be spent by this certain date, and I need someone to come to Chile. I was like, I'm there. This is yeah. And so then you go there, and then, of course the data is in Spanish, which I don't speak, but, so you've got someone local who can kind of translate. So yes, you try to understand the data. We developed a model. Well, first you developed a model that was a very standard model, and we sort of went, great, we've got something. And then she said, this just feels like every other model. And I'm like, you're right, this is every other model. And then we threw that away and came up with really innovative stuff. And I was like, this would not have happened except that we were sitting side by side and just basically chewing the fat and just saying, yeah, but we could do better, surely. And we came up with really, really interesting stuff. We then met with local public health people who came to the meetings, some of whom had math background and some of whom didn't. And so, again, you need to be able to talk to these people. And I have a big background in doing that. I've been in departments where I was the only mathematician. I've worked with doctors who, don't understand the equations and kind of don't want to and don't have the time to, and you have to learn how to speak the language and stuff. So because I have all these skills together, these are really handy. And so it's basically sort of working with people. So it's a mixture of kind of, yes, grabbing data that's there, working with people who are local, coming up with innovative ideas, and then communicating those ideas in the right way to the right people. And I do a lot of this stuff.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
It really is. I mean, it must be the kind of thing where, you can't go for too many days without feeling like I'm doing something really valuable in the world. I mean, that's fabulous.
Yeah, exactly. And I sort of feel like I got the golden ticket in the the Willy Wonka competition. And so I'm definitely. I'm very much a proponent of like public good. Like I think that I guess I grew up very working class, and so I didn't have any academic background at all, and I had to figure it all out myself. And I think that's a piece of it. It felt like we're all in it together back then. And I feel like now, both probably sort of, having jumped the class barrier a bit and also, kind of, in a different time, there's a lot more individualism, right? And people are sort of like, oh, we need to, like it's everyone for themselves. And you see all kinds of issues with like, anti-vaccination movements and so on, kind of pushing against that. Whereas I feel like sort of, after the Second World War, say, everybody was community minded. Everyone was like, we need to solve these problems together. Let's embed healthcare almost everywhere in the world, and let's solve problems, and let's have social safety net and all kinds of things. And we've kind of had a long time since we've had any real serious existential threat to societies, despite whatever you might read in the news. That just hasn't happened. Like we don't watch 3/5 of our friends just get killed, right? It's like threat of that, but there's not the actuality of it. Right. And so we haven't had this kind of massive societal need to kind of band together and do stuff. And I think this is a real shame in a lot of ways, because I don't think we should be having 3/5 of us dying, but we could still possibly do good things by being in it together. Mm-hmm. And that is just not how the world seems to work most of the time. Well, I should say certainly at least the Western world. And so in a lot of developing countries, of course, that is the way, because that's the only thing that people have. And so I find there's a lot more community-minded spirit in a lot of places where people are willing to be like, yeah, let's figure stuff out and let's do it all together, and let's all, pitch in with all our skills and make stuff better. And I feel like that's, usually the way to success, is because I don't have all the answers, but I have my answers and other people have theirs, and you can combine, and then you often make much richer things.
I would think so. And I have to think that the anti-vaccination movement must be kind of frustrating for you.
Oh, deeply frustrating. But I, on the other hand, I sort of like, there's a piece of me that kind of gets it too, right? I don't agree with it, but I also understand where people are coming from. Like science has kind of, elevated in really innovative ways, but it's such that, nobody can understand all of science, right? We have to take a lot of stuff on trust. And so that's where suddenly, you're not doing experiments yourself, and you're probably not even able to follow many of the experiments, and you're sort of seeing, high-level physics things, labs that cost millions or whatever and stuff. And you're like, yeah, okay, they're doing some weird stuff and they're making all these claims. And also there's lots of claims that come out all the time. And I think some of it's malicious too, right? There is, like the climate change stuff really muddied the waters around kind of science, mm-hmm. right? And this is a very deliberate kind of thing that was happening. It basically hijacked what happens normally in science and just pushed it. And you kind of get to this thing, like you always read these studies, right? This week coffee is good for you. Next week it's bad for you. Wine is going to make you live longer. No, wine is terrible. Don't drink it. And what are people going to do? Very naturally, they're going to say, I can't rely on any of this stuff because it's all contradictory. So I'll just throw my hands in the air and do whatever the hell I want, right? Because that's an easy way to do it. And if there was a clear path, people would probably do it more, right? But without the clear path, people just say, I can't make sense of it. And it's beyond most people's experience to actually reach any of it. And the problem is vaccines get caught up in that. And vaccines have been a very clear public good, right? Many of us are alive because of vaccines. And yet, if you look back in history, the anti-vax movement is not new. The anti-vax movement has existed as long as vaccines have existed. So smallpox, that was, one of those diseases where people had like 10 children because 7 of them are going to die of smallpox, right? And then they invented a vaccine in like the 1700s, so a very long time ago. And of course, the vaccine was very popular. So everybody got the vaccine. And the word vaccine comes from vache, which is French for cow, because cowpox was a disease that cows had, and cowpox prevented smallpox. So they basically injected people with cowpox, and that prevented smallpox. And for a generation, this is great, right? Everyone's like, oh, amazing. Now my kids are not dying. Like, people are living, and you're seeing the effects. And then you go through a couple of generations, and people start to say, well, I haven't seen any of this smallpox for a while. Mm-hmm. And why are we injecting this cowpox? And they actually in the 1800s they had like political cartoons which had people as half human, half cow hybrids.
Oh, jeez.
Because if you get the vaccine, you'll turn into a cow, right? And that seems laughable now. And I'm sure the autism thing is going to seem laughable in 200 years to our descendants. But it's exactly the same thing. It's basically people have not seen these bad diseases, and they're wondering why they have to do with a thing that seems a little inconvenient. And of course, exactly what happened, right? People stop taking the vaccine, and for a while it's fine, and then the smallpox comes back, and then it starts killing all the kids again, and then people say, oh, I should get that vaccine again. And these cycles went on, and it went on for 200 years, right? And it's back and forth, and eventually it kind of damped down, and finally smallpox was eradicated. But the way it was finally eradicated was they sent helicopters into the last few villages in the former Yugoslavia, and they just force vaccinated whole villages. And people clearly said, we don't want this vaccine. And the World Health Organization said, too bad, you're getting it. And success. They eradicated smallpox from the planet. This is an amazing achievement. It's one of history's biggest things that we've ever done as humans, right? And we trampled over some individual rights in doing so. And that was in the 70s. So could we do that now? Almost certainly not, right? So we don't have that kind of power anymore. We respect individual rights, which is a good thing most of the time, but sometimes there are necessary circumstances. And so I feel like, this stuff gets very messy. And the reality is we're going to, a lot of people are going to die. And then people are going to sort of say, oh, we should vaccinate again. And the cycle is going to just continue. And over time, probably the arc bends towards good things, but a lot of people are going to suffer in the meantime, and it's kind of sad. But it's also, I think I take a bit more of a philosophical view, as much as I'm, actually actively trying to fight against it. I am doing some work on trying to sort of, see if we can quantify anti-vaxxers and, kind of figure some stuff out there. But I'm also aware that this is how humans are.
Yeah, I hadn't realized that there was such a reaction against the smallpox vaccine. So it is a little bit reassuring to think that it's not new.
Yeah, we've always sucked. And we have always sucked. So, well.
Oh, well. Well, since that's such a cheery subject, let's get into how you got to writing Doctor Who related things.
Yes. Yeah, so it's quite a different hat that I wear when I wear my writing hat. So I would say, if you trace it back, though, it all has the same root. So I was always a big Doctor Who fan. And so in the 90s, when there was no TV show, there were books, and I was reading the books, which I really enjoyed. And then the internet came along. And I'd written a few things for fanzines back in the day, but the fanzines had this issue of like, well, you have to write your piece, whatever it is. You have no particular feedback on it. You put it in an envelope and you mail it away, and you hope that the editor likes it enough to include it in the 24 pages that they have, where you're competing against everybody else. And when you don't really know what you're doing, the first couple of things you write are going to be pretty terrible, of course. And then you get rejected. And then you think, well, that's not for me, maybe. Right? Instead of realizing maybe you're just learning your craft. And I had a couple of things published here and there, but it was, they weren't that great, and I had a lot of rejections and so on. Then the internet came along, and there's no space limitations. And I was like, oh, I can write any old thing and put it online, and it's fine. And of course, I put up some things. Some were good and some were bad, some I cringe at or whatever. And one particular thing I started to do was review the books. I started writing reviews, and there was a bunch of people writing reviews, and I thought, oh, yeah, I enjoy reading people's reviews. I'll write some too. I read a book. Let me just write about it. Here's what I liked about it. And I started with a few paragraphs, and then it became longer and longer. But, I would throw in jokes because, I've seen people. And after a while, and I would say after many years, people started to be like, man, your reviews are really funny, and they're really sharp, and they're really on point. And you're analyzing these novels with this, amazing scalpel. And I'm like, oh, am I? I'm just writing down what I think. And, then I realized, no. I have a math brain. My math brain is just taking the plot and saying, but the logic is not there. And I would just be sort of, pointing stuff out and doing it in a funny way. And actually the authors started to come back and say, okay, so you're kind of a scary reviewer now. And I was like, really? I'm a pussycat. Like, what are you talking about? I was like, oh, but online, I guess I probably am. And it was really interesting because you started to sort of see the process and so on. And then because of that, I got a gig kind of writing for a print fanzine. And that was kind of it was Enlightenment. It was a Canadian fanzine. And we had to write every other month. So it was 6 issues a year. I wrote for every single issue for 10 years. And you had to do it. And you had to write within word count, and you had to write on an interesting topic. And you have an editor who's going to reject you or, cut your piece, if it's, to ribbons if they don't like it or whatever, which all that stuff always happens, of course. But after a while, I, basically became the star writer of this thing. And I was like, man, I'm good at this. And I was like, I really got the hang of this. And that was not my dream at all. My dream was to be a fiction writer. And at the same time, I'm sort of, writing fiction. They had some fiction zines as well, and I was doing some fanfic here and there, and and we sort of write some stuff. And I was like, I can do it, but man, it's hard work. And so then I'm, fast forward many years, and I met a publisher, and it was a publisher that I had made fun of online. And when he met me, he was like, wow, your stuff is really funny. And I was like, oh, big of you to say. He's like, no. He's like, I don't kind of mind, as long as you're fair, it's fine. And you're always fair. And he's like, man, you kind of made fun of me, but boy, I laughed. I was like, oh, well, it's like, what a stand-up guy this is. Like, because I'm cringing a little, saying, oh, I didn't mean to. And he's like, no. And then I said, well, do you take pictures? Can I pitch something to you? And he said, oh, normally no, but actually from you, yeah, because I've read your reviews online. And I was thinking, I never wrote one of those reviews to be any kind of pitch document, and a lot of people were very concerned because they were like, oh, what if, Big Finish or someone finds my stuff online and I criticize them, I better delete that or whatever. And I was much more like, no, we need to not hold back. We need to, it's very important for us to have the freedom to say, to be critical if we need to and so on. And just want to do it in a smart way. And so that very thing actually got me kind of my first gig. And originally I was trying to do fiction, and he sort of said, well, there's more of a market for nonfiction if you're into that. And it was that pivotal moment where I went, I'm so into that. I'm so good at that. Oh, wow, there's a market for it. And I'm I have to say amazing at it. And fiction, I'm not amazing at. I'm only so-so. And I was like, oh, let me totally switch hats. And so then I was like, right, I'm going to be a nonfiction person. And I think one of the things that I bring to it is, it's not just dry and dusty kind of facts and figures, which a lot of nonfiction often is. It's like, oh, let me, provide an episode guide to a show or something. And it's just, here's fact, here's figure, here's a cast list, here's a summary of the episode. It's like, that's so boring. Like, also, with the internet, you have that stuff already. Like, if I want to know who was in the latest episode, I'll Google that, right? What you can't just Google necessarily is like, amazing insights and kind of, comedy stuff and so. I mean, you can, of course, but it's harder to find and, also you bring something in that way. And so for me, it's very much about like, what can I bring that's not found elsewhere? And that's sort of turned into a whole thing. And so my co-author Graham Burke and I, we were kind of, on the same page. He was actually my editor for the fanzine. And so we kind of, launched into a kind of, the first book that we did together was it was a collection of fan articles kind of thing. And I thought it was fantastic. He and I were both like, wow, we've got something really great here. And I still stand by that. I think it was absolutely amazing. The problem is it had a boring title, a boring cover, a boring subtitle, a boring back cover. So nobody ever opened that book. And so, and I know it's still around occasionally. It's called Time Unincorporated. And you see it at people at conventions, even people who I know love my other books. And they sort of pick it up. Maybe they see my name on the cover. So they pick it up and they sort of look at it and kind of maybe like flick through and just put it down again. And I'm like, yeah, right. This book had no appeal. And, it doesn't matter what was inside.
Right.
There was
What a
nothing
shame.
selling it. Yeah. And it was a great and humbling lesson for me. I was like, oh, wow, we wrote a book and it sunk like a stone. And we did another one and it sunk like a stone. And the third one, that took off. And so it was kind of like, wow, that was a steep learning curve. But it also taught me a lot about you have to market your book correctly, not just leave it to the marketing people, because they have, some skills, of course, but they don't always know what it is exactly about your book that's working. And sometimes they try and market it the wrong way and so on. And so we often build in now stuff that makes it appealing. And so, we kind of find the hook, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and I know one of the books is a guide to classic Who for people who might not venture in otherwise. And
yes,
because I
right.
am such a classic Who fangirl and I try not to get frustrated with people who've never tried it, who write it off without looking at it. I find that very difficult. I'm curious to know how has that book been received by the people who've read it? Have you actually managed to convert many people who otherwise are like, but it's grainy black and white and the monsters are made of bubble wrap and why would I watch this?
Yeah. Yes. So the answer is actually, yeah, absolutely. We have converted people and also people who've used our book to convert their friends. Because it's not watch everything because there's too much of it. So we did it as the 50 Doctor Who stories to watch before you die. And it was the 50th anniversary. Some of course, the new series ones, but yeah, there's about probably 35 odd for the classic series. And it runs from all eras and all doctors and so on. And we tested this out in our editor and she was a new Doctor Who fan, but never seen a classic episode. And so she mainlined the entire sort of, history of classic Doctor Who and kind of fast forward. Because what we realized through writing this was we were writing a history of Doctor Who. We didn't realize we were doing it until we were partway through.
Mm-hmm.
We were like, oh, right, because we're taking just kind of, the cherries on top of Doctor Who, you're really seeing this really cool show happening. And I remember watching the episodes myself going I watched, you watch Unearthly Child, and then it's the Daleks, then you skip to the Aztecs, and I think then we jump to the War Machines, and then it's kind of Tomb of the Cybermen, and then, you're kind of jumping across. And I'm watching this going Doctor Who was the greatest show ever. This is great. I'm only watching the great ones. It wasn't only super quality, because that's kind of a bit boring too. So we threw in some stuff to mix it up. We have the Leisure Hive and the Happiness Patrol and Frontios and things in there that we think are important to watch, and it also gives you a flavor of Doctor Who. But it's not sort of just Android Invasion or something where you just okay, I'm just watching this because it's on and it's between two things. Yeah. And so our editor had she sort of immersed herself in classic Who and kind of I think she found the black and white era a little slow, but once she got to the color, she's like, oh my god, Spearhead from Space, this is my new favorite story, and and she was suddenly really engaging in the process, and we sort of thought, okay, this can work. And we have definitely done this with multiple people, and sometimes people are they're not going to watch 50 of them, but they might watch a couple, and at least it's in the guide as to what you might like to see and so on.
That's so cool, because I know people who are really, really resistant, and I mean, it's their right to be resistant. They don't have to watch anything they don't want to watch, but I love the idea of, I don't know, I think I usually end up saying something like, yes, the sets wobble and there's green bubble wrap, and sometimes there's a lot of filler and you wish it would go a little bit faster, but underneath it all, there tends to be a pretty good story.
Yeah, a very funny thing happened recently, because I was dating someone who was quite a bit younger, and so we watched New Doctor Who, and she really liked it, and she's like, "Oh, this is great." And then she's like, "Can I see some classic here?" And I was sort of like, "Okay, I just need to warn you, you put all these writers in, right?" Like, okay, and then and she said, "Oh, I really like Cybermen. Let's see something with Cybermen." And she's like, "And I kind of want to see." We're having debates about how violent should the Doctor be, and so on. She's like, "Show me the most violent Doctor episode with Cybermen." I'm like, "Okay, well, the obvious choice is Attack of the Cybermen, but I feel like this is not a great and so I kind of let it out. She's like, "Okay, let's watch that one." I was like, "This is a terrible idea. Why am I showing this person Attack of the Cybermen as her?" And she loved it.
Wow.
I was like, "Oh, that was not expected." And one of the things she particularly loved was she loved the practical effects. She's like, "They build everything." She's like, "I never see practical effects anymore, really ever." She's like, I grew up on CGI, that's what we got. That's how special effects are. She's like, "Oh my god, that Cyberman comes through the wall. It came through the wall." She was just totally taken by this, and so she was like, "This is great. Let's watch more." And then she wanted to see the origin of Cybermen, which the 10th planet. I'm like, I am violating every rule I've ever had. Black and white Doctor Who. It's a incomplete story. There's a regeneration at the end. There's her second story. And again, she loved it. And so and then we just sort of potted our way through Doctor Who, and we ended up sort of doing a kind of Philip Hinchcliffe years marathon where we just watched it all, and it was great. And so I was like, I can't believe this happened. This is every dream I ever had come true. And so I find sort of the old sort of thing of the sets wobble and so on. I think if you're kind of of the generation who cringed watching that when you were growing up, then you need to warn people about it. But I think if you're young, if you're a millennial and you're watching Doctor Who that's old, it's old. You don't have to basically apologize for it, because everything looks the same that's old, and it's not like, oh, this one is bad because it's but no, it's all of the same. And so sets wobble, that's part of the charm.
Yeah, what's strange to me are the ones where they've taken the old episodes and they've souped up the special effects, because to me it's just but they don't fit.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. There's ways to do that well and ways to do it badly.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was Earthshock where you can, I have the DVD and you can choose which effects you want. And I never ever put the new ones on because they just look so incredibly out of place to me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the clever things they did was Day of the Daleks, because they got, they went back to the original location, which is still there. And they got, some of the old Daleks, whatever. And then they got the actual cameras. And so they found the old camera. And they filmed with that. And it's so it integrates seamlessly because it just feels like it's a 1973 kind of, production. And you're like, wow, there's a lot more Daleks and Ogrons in here, but otherwise, it looks like it would have,
That's cool. I haven't seen that. I'll have to check it out. Mm-hmm. So what would you say is the most underrated classic Who story?
Oh, what a very good question. The most underrated. Wow. Okay. I would say maybe something like the Happiness Patrol, and I know why it's underrated, but I also think that is one of those stories where there's just so much to mine in there. I think the Seventh Doctor era is one of those ones where if you were there at the time, you either loved it or hated it. And I think sort of now people kind of have this very odd kind of relationship with it. But I think it's an amazing era, and I think they were really kind of pushing themselves to try and make really interesting points. I mean, the very fact that like when the script editor got hired and the producer said, so what do you want to do with Doctor Who? And he said, bring down the government. And you think, okay, that's not been said in any other time. Like that is amazing. And the Happiness Patrol is kind of like the time when they really actively trying to do that,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, yep. We're not hiding this at all. We're really actually trying to do this, and make this political commentary and so on. And so, I mean, as a story, of course, it's got its flaws and sometimes very obvious flaws, but also kind of makes it what it is as well. But there are, I mean, I would say also a great many underrated Doctor Who stories all over the map. I mean, something like the Seeds of Doom is not underrated in many ways. People would say, oh, of course, that's like a classic. Mm-hmm. But it's not a classic people think about, right? It's just like, oh, yeah, that's one of those maker ones that's kind of good, right? And you watch it and you're like, this is not just good. This is astonishing. This is an absolutely amazing piece of television that, you sort of feel like, how have I not appreciated this before? And then you realize it's because everything around it also feels just as amazing. And so it kind of just sits there with this beautiful run of quality. And you're like, wow, we were so lucky to get
mm-hmm.
this.
Yeah, that one was one that, I mean, I didn't start watching till I was probably about 14, I would guess, 13 or 14. Mm-hmm. And that was one that I saw pretty early on, along with the Pyramids of Mars, which I love, but which gave me nightmares at the time. And I think the Seeds of Doom was not far behind it. So, I love it, but I also, there's still that little part of me that's kind of like, oh yeah, that monster. Ooh, I don't need to see that. Actually, no, I think the human villain in that one was scarier than the monster.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
he was very, very creepy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So do you have a favorite?
So I probably don't have a single favorite. I mean, I have so many favorites.
It's kind of an unfair question.
Yeah, I know. But I guess my go-to answer is probably Remembrance of the Daleks.
Okay, that's a good one.
I just think that is, it kind of deconstructs Doctor Who in this really amazing way. It like takes all the kind of like touchstones of Doctor. It's like, it's a Doctor, he's this guy in a scarf fighting Daleks, and there's Unit, basically, and there's, it's on Earth, and, there's kind of all this stuff, and yet, there's Davros, and everything's kind of in there, but what it does with it is astonishing, and it really kind of pulls apart Doctor Who to kind of see what it is and how it works, and it kind of takes it apart, and then it puts it back together and says, yeah, we can actually do something with this. And the fact that you basically have the Doctor being called out for, being committing genocide and stuff like that, and he's kind of like, yeah, I do that, and and watch me again. I'll do this right now, and this is amazing to me. And here's this man who won't pick up a gun, and yet he'll talk this Dalek to death.
Yeah,
and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I find the whole won't pick up a gun, but element of that character really fascinating.
Yes, yeah,
and I also kind of going back to what you said a while ago, about 3 years ago, I made a list of, just on a whim, of all the things I learned from Doctor Who, and I expected it to be this list of silly things like reverse the polarity and stuff like that. Yes. And then I realized that, I guess it was 2016, so not quite 3 years ago, but it was very, very close to the 53rd anniversary. So I thought, okay, I'll see if I can come up with 53 things. Well, you run out of the silly things pretty quickly when you try to do that. And I ended up discovering just how much that show made me who I am and shaped, how I see the world and that kind of thing. So I find it kind of comforting to know that I'm not the only one who falls into that category, even though it took me a long time to figure it out.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So I love that, Logopolis was a thing for you, and
absolutely key.
Yeah, I think I need to watch that again. I missed the showing the other week in the theater, so. But
I missed it too because I was traveling, and yes, I'm very sad I missed that.
But modeling the universe. Why not? What happens when the model breaks down? Oops.
Lots and lots of entropy.
Very, very much. So, well, this has been a whole lot of fun. I'm really glad we talked.
Yes, this has been excellent.
Thank you. And, keep up the excellent zombie modeling, among other things. You're clearly out, doing your own Doctor thing in your own way, which is awesome.
Yes.
So thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you have a whole new perspective on the art and science of mathematics, and maybe even the usefulness of zombies. Many thanks to Robert Smith for joining me. You can find show notes, the 6 creative beliefs that are screwing you up, and more at fycuriosity.com. I'd also love for you to join the conversation on Instagram. You'll find me at fycuriosity. Follow Your Curiosity is produced by me, Nancy Norbeck, with music by Joseph McDade. If you like Follow Your Curiosity, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. It really helps me reach new listeners. See you next time.